Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the CDS, General Senator Nika, for another invitation to return to this very professional conference. And I go to quite a few. And I'd particularly like to thank or say how good the cultural demonstration was last night. That is the best representation of Sri Lanka you can get. And I was jealous because I'm not sure that Australia or the US is quite as good at presenting it the way it was last night. So congratulations to them. So my intention today is to give you a view of the US view of the role of the military in countering violent extremist organisations. So your first thought might be, it's a bit strange to have an Australian talking about the United States. It's not strange at all, particularly in the US Army, where in a number of the key organisations, officers from other nations are deputy commanders or chiefs of staff. For example, 82nd Airborne, 3rd US Corps, 1st US Corps, US Army in Alaska. So in the US system, the integration of allies into the military is a key component of it. So I'm kind of normal in that respect. So if I had to summarise the US view, it's pretty simple, which is the military is a key contributor in the fight against violent extremist organisations. But it is only one contributor. And success depends on a joint, interagency, whole of government, and in the 21st century, multinational response against that threat. So I was asked to talk about this in a destabilized system. That is not a term I would personally use. The international system, you could argue stability many ways. So this chart, for example, looks at great power conflict. And if that's your measure of stability, we're in the best it's ever been. So rather than use stable or destabilised, I'd make some observations about the international system. One is it continually evolves and adapts. The second is there are actors that challenge the system and directly attack it with the aim of destabilising it. And then we do know that around the globe there are ungoverned spaces and contested spaces, and violent extremists do particularly well and operate better in those spaces. So to lift a line from the national security strategy of the United States, terrorists and criminals thrive where governments are weak, corruption is rampant, and faith in government institutions is low. I just make a point, if you haven't read the National Security Strategy of the United States, it's on the White House website, it's unclassified, and you can read it for yourself. So I'll cover quickly these things. So I'll look at the real world as it is. I'm a soldier, not an academic, and how we view it, particularly in the US Army. A quick look at the adversary, and then back to some of the themes from yesterday. You need to think about the adversary in terms of the future. Also, picking up on another theme that's developed, what about confronting this adversary in the information age? And I'll give you one case study. And then I'll end with, therefore, here are the enduring tenets of the US strategy. And this is how US Army Pacific, as one of the contributors in the military lane, realises that strategy. So a better model than destabilised stable, we would say, is view the world as a complex system. And on the left of this slide, looking at our own region, you can see the multiple variables and reasons it's increasingly complex. Inside that circle, more people live than outside that circle on the planet. We have many megacities. The projection for population growth sees an increase in importance in the region. And we have many of the largest military forces on the globe are all operating in the Indo-Pacific. On the right-hand side is the US National Security Strategy articulation of some of the key actors in the modern world. So there are competitors, there are threats, and there are real-time adversaries. And violent extremists are real-time adversaries that we confront today. One of the key deductions in US strategy is that in the 21st century, allies, partners and friends are fundamentally important to the success of the United States and for all of us to realise shared objectives. That's a basic underlying tenet in the strategy. Going to the threat. So on this slide, there's a picture of some incidences of violent extremism. And you'll note I use the term violent extremists, not political extremists. And that's the US term. And it emphasises the violence component rather than the motivation component. So that's the term you'll hear the US use. These are some examples, but there are examples across the region. There are examples from Australia, the United States, Canada. Sri Lanka has its own deep experience with combating violent extremism. So it is not the province of a particular country or a particular religion or a particular politics. Also key in the 21st century is it's often transnational, and it can be a mix. General Orrit talking about motivations. It can be a mix of motivations, transnational, lone wolf, domestic, different in every iteration, but often linked transnationally. Also, in the 21st century, the ubiquitous existence of information technology links them all. So the US approach is to build really a coalition and a holistic response to that threat. So I'd go back to yesterday on the futures. We're talking about the futures. So if it's a complex world that's dynamic with lots of actors, thinking about the future is critical, because what worked yesterday in that circumstance may not work tomorrow in a different circumstance. And these quotes, just to jog your thoughts, if you look at the top right, that makes the point that be careful what you predict. The future is inherently unpredictable. So that scientist was clearly wrong about computer technology, and he knew he was in danger even as he said it. But that does not mean you do not think about the future and the multiple possible futures that there might be. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see one of the speakers yesterday mentioned Frank Hoffman, hybrid warfare specialist. That's how he characterises the revolution in military affairs. And there are many ways of doing it and many iterations. But the last two are the ones that we saw yesterday and many speakers have discussed are impacting right now significantly. Information revolution and the autonomous revolution. And then the bottom right quote is there to terrify you. That is the more drastic view of where the future is headed. And that's where you have exponential growth in multiple technologies, some of which have not been discussed here. Biology, nanotechnology, combining to change everything. Everything. And that particular futurist, he says that happens not in 2250, that happens in 2135. So the future is coming at us at an exponential rate. So I put this up to say militaries need to think hard about how do we deal with where this might be headed. Our adversaries operate and have the same problem and exploit the changes as much as we will. So another example, non-American, Chinese, from 19 years ago. Two colonels who looked hard at the future. Read the quote and consider the modern world. And they raised issues of multi-domain. So a contest across all domains, air, land, sea, what's become cyber and space. They talk about military force and the role of military and the nature of conflict. This is before 9/11. I would argue that many of the ideas in this quote that is 19 years old underpin, not directly, but underpin some of the thinking in modern US strategy about competition and competitive advantage and the nature of a whole of government interagency approach to strategy. The other point is it is worth thinking about the future, and if you do it in a constructive, considered way, you can position yourself well. So I'd like to deep dive briefly on this issue of information, the information age, and how violent extremists use it and what it does for the contest. And so this is something you all know. There's an exponential growth and spread of information technology and systems. The violent extremists operate inside that system. So they use it to communicate, and there's all the multiple means that you can do that. I think more importantly, there is now a manoeuvre fight in this space about legitimacy and credibility and influence. That is an age-old competition, but is now enabled globally through technology. So I want to give you a practical example from my own personal experience from Iraq in 2016. So how does this come together in the real world? Well, I saw myself the narrative contest played out globally, regionally, nationally and locally between Daesh, ISIS, and the Iraqis and the international coalition. And so this slide tries to capture that. So on the left, you get the brand ISIS, the black flags, the weapons, the unstoppable righteous wave sweeping across Syria and Iraq. Compellingly distributed, as we heard from one of the previous speakers. That image was dominant in Iraq in 2016, even though nobody from ISIS or Daesh moved that way in Iraq in 2016. They would be destroyed. But that image was repeatedly played in the West, repeatedly played everywhere as brand ISIS. And the Iraqis understood, I think, fundamentally, you've got to contest the image. And you've got to aggressively contest it in all domains with all means. So a couple of examples. The top photo outside Fallujah, and the clearance of Fallujah had begun. In the photo is Iranian General Soleimani, Mohandas, the Shia militia, the National Security Advisor for Iraq. This message is, hey, we're unified against you, ISIS. And it was a message of inevitable victory. We will defeat you, ISIS, because everybody is against you. Notably absent is the coalition, because the coalition did not operate with Iran or with the Shia militia. But the Iraqis knew we had common objectives and articulated that through all available means. And the next two slides, I want to make a point. There's been a lot of discussion of cyber, but cyber is one way that humans interact. It's massively expanded and important, but humans still talk to each other. Humans still watch the television. They listen to the radio. And in the middle, you'll see leaflets. So one of the ways Iraqis influenced the populations that were under ISIS control was through dropping leaflets, which is a Second World War technique. They use all available means to contest the narrative, reach all the audiences, and communicate. And on the bottom, you'll see next to the dog biting the antenna is an Iraqi Special Forces operator trained by the coalition, enabled as a combat cameraman to record images and the story of the combat troops with a BGAN satellite terminal, uploading images direct to the Ministry of Defence for immediate distribution, to be as fast and as effective as ISIS had been. Last point about the information age is that reality still matters. And what the Iraqis taught us You leverage reality. So the combat success of the Iraqi security forces was the underlying arbiter and the message that could be spread. So you could try to do it without actual combat success, you could. ISIS certainly did. But the credibility of combining action with messaging and a coherent narrative was really compelling. And the Iraqis taught me personally a lot. And I think they taught us all, this is what you have to do when you're confronting what for them was an existential threat. And this just makes the point. It's one metric, it doesn't mean victory. It's just West Point tracks at the Counter-Terrorism Centre ISIS messaging. So in a long-term global sense, you can see the trend line on their messaging over time. Does that mean they're beaten? Does that mean they're not being successful? No, it's only one metric. But I put it up as a view. They can be contested and defeated, and they must be contested and defeated in the narrative and information space. So getting to the US. This slide summarises the US approach, which frankly is pretty straightforward, and it comes from that worldview that I've tried to articulate. First of all, you need to understand the threat in the environment and put a lot of effort into listening, watching, learning, adapting and cooperating. The threat everywhere is different. The operating environment everywhere is different. Sri Lanka's not the same as Bangladesh, it's not the same as San Diego, it's not the same as Japan. The second one's very important for the use of force. So respect of sovereignty and the rule of law. Use of force is not unconstrained. In the US system, it's highly constrained and it's accountable. The information age amplifies the importance of that. So you cannot do what you want. It is highly constrained by a combination of international law, domestic law, policy, etc. And that is a reality for the US military. It's a whole of government, whole of nation approach. So in the US system, it's an interagency problem, not a military problem, to defeat violent extremists. And it takes all elements of national power to do that. So the US emphasises that. And we had talk yesterday about homeland security. So for example, there's very close cooperation between the Department of Defence in the United States and Homeland Security, a daily, constant interaction. The other big change maybe is a re-emphasis on the importance of multilateral and multinational cooperation. That's a long-term US view. It's just been strengthened in the latest analysis of the strategy. So the message to other nations is the US is looking hard at where cooperation can exist, what objectives are, what strengths can we share, what can we leverage off you, what can you leverage off the United States. And then we've got to contest violent extremists at every level. It's not just a military engagement, it's all domains, constantly, and the phrase that's emerging is in an integrated fashion. So we would argue, or the Joint Staff use the expression, we tend to do episodic synchronisation. We cooperate when we need to in places specifically. We need to move to a space where we are always integrated. Before conflict, during conflict, after conflict, multinational interagency. Last point is the army is the action arm, one of the action arms of strategy, and our method is up there on the screen. So this seminar contributes to US strategy objectives because we're having a dialogue about the threat and the world. Doesn't contribute necessarily a lot to the defeat of ISIS, but it's part of many efforts to build that coalition effort against common threats. And so exercises, multilateral forums, subject matter expert exchange, sharing concepts and data. We have our Asia Pacific Counter ID Centre, for example, sharing around the region, how do you deal with IEDs? Plus combined operations, focus on sometimes direct action, removing safe havens, severing support and strength to adversaries. So the army is one part of that combined interagency approach. And that's it. Thanks, sir.